You wake to the sound of your mother's cough, wet, thick, rattling in the darkness of a room that smells like rot and fever. You shift on the straw beneath you, and something moves with you, something small, something alive. Your scalp burns, your armpits sting, and when you scratch, you feel the familiar welts that have become part of your skin, as permanent as your own bones. Before we go deeper into this story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? It amazes me that we're connected across centuries and continents by our shared curiosity about how people really lived. The year is 1347, and across the fields and forests of medieval Europe, millions of people are waking up just like this. Not in castles, not in monasteries with their rules and their clean stone floors, but in single-room huts where entire families sleep together on straw that hasn't been changed in months, where the walls are made of mud and dung and straw and the roof leaks, and the floor is packed dirt that absorbs everything, blood, urine, vomit, spilled food, all of it soaking into the ground they walk on every day. We know about these people not from grand chronicles but from fragments, tax records, court rolls, manor account books. Names like Guillaume de Montfort, a peasant farmer recorded in the tax ledgers of 1352. He lived with his wife Marguerite and their 4 children in a village called Beaumont, about 30 miles north of Paris. And we know one other thing about Guillaume. The water he carried to his family each morning came from the Ourcq River, the same river where the village dumped its waste, where animals drank, where women washed clothing when they could afford soap at all. The water was brown, not slightly tinted. Brown like tea left to steep too long, thick with sediment and life that would kill a modern person within hours. But this was their drinking water, their cooking water, the only water they had. Medieval peasants understood that water could be dangerous. They preferred running water over stagnant pools because they saw that still water bred sickness. But they didn't understand that their entire village, using the same running water for everything, drinking, washing, waste, turned that water into a slow poison. Sometimes Guillaume would let the buckets sit overnight, hoping the worst of the mud would settle. Sometimes there wasn't time. Sometimes his children were too thirsty to wait. So they drank it brown, and they survived because their bodies had no choice but to adapt. But here's the paradox that makes this story so haunting. Many attempts at cleanliness made survival less likely, not more. Take Marie Duclos, a peasant woman from a village near Reims, recorded in a church register from 1289 AD. Once a year before Easter, she saved fuel for weeks to heat enough water for a full bath. She had no soap, so she scrubbed her skin with sand and a rough cloth until it bled. She had no clean clothes to put on afterward. The dress she wore into the bath was the only one she owned besides her Sunday dress, which had to be saved for church. Within days of that bath, Marie developed a fever. The scratches from the sand had become infected. Her family had no medicine, no understanding of what infection even was. She recovered eventually, but the lesson was clear. Washing was dangerous. It was better to stay dirty. And dirty they stayed, not by choice, not from ignorance, but because every alternative carried its own lethal risk. In the archives of Canterbury Cathedral, there's a record from 1376 AD mentioning a woman named Agnes, known as the soap maker. She was one of the few people in her region who knew the complex process of making soap, rendering animal fat, mixing it with wood ash, boiling it for hours. Her services were in demand among merchants and minor gentry. But in that same record, from a trial where she was accused of theft, Agnes herself is described as unwashed and verminous, with hair so matted it appeared as one solid mass upon her head. The woman who made soap for others couldn't afford to use soap herself, because soap required animal fat, and animal fat required slaughtering an animal, and animals were wealth. A peasant family might make soap twice a year if they were fortunate. More often, they made do with nothing or with sand that left their skin raw and bleeding, creating perfect pathways for infection to enter their bodies. But if washing was rare and soap was precious, what about the most basic human need? Water to drink. They drank ale instead. Weak ale, brewed from barley or wheat, was safer than water because the brewing process killed many of the organisms that made water deadly. Even children drank ale with their breakfast. A typical peasant family in 14th century England consumed between 3 and 5 gallons of ale per day. Not because they were drunkards, but because ale kept them alive. Yet ale doesn't clean your body. And your body, if you were a medieval peasant, was an ecosystem unto itself. Every person, not some, not most, but every single person from king to beggar, had lice. The difference was that nobles had servants who spent hours each day picking lice from their hair and clothing. Peasants simply lived with them. In the manor records of Yorkshire from 1356 AD, there's a note about a woman named Isabella Farrow, mentioned by her local priest because her hair was so infested with lice that they could be seen moving even during Mass. This wasn't scandalous. It was simply noted because the movement was distracting to other worshippers. Lice weren't the only inhabitants. Medieval peasants hosted communities of parasites, fleas in their clothing, scabies mites burrowing beneath their skin, intestinal worms that could grow several feet long. A medical text from 1295 AD, written by a monk named Brother Albertus, describes treating a peasant woman whose belly was so distended with worms she appeared pregnant. When the worms were expelled through purging, they filled a bucket and writhed like snakes. This was normal, expected, part of being alive. But perhaps nothing captures the horror of medieval peasant hygiene quite like teeth. They ate coarse bread, ground from grain that still contained pieces of the millstone itself, wearing their teeth down to stumps by their 30s. They had no sugar, which was protective, but they also had no way to clean their teeth. Some used frayed twigs, others used cloth strips. Most used nothing. In the court rolls of Essex from 1312 AD, a man named Roger the Miller is described as having no teeth remaining in his mouth by his 40th year. His gums so swollen and infected that he could consume only pottage and ale. A traveling Italian merchant named Francesco de Marco, writing home to Florence in 1378 AD, complained, "The common people here have breath so foul it could knock a man senseless. I have taken to breathing through my mouth when I must conduct business with them, though this brings its own torments." The smell of medieval peasants was so overwhelming that even people accustomed to far lower standards of hygiene than ours found it unbearable. Yet here's what's remarkable. They functioned. They worked from dawn to dusk in fields fertilized with human waste. They raised children who survived infancy despite being born into contaminated environments. They fell in love, celebrated marriages, mourned their dead, created songs and stories and traditions that have echoed down through centuries. Brother Thomas of Ally, a monk writing in 1298 AD, described visiting a peasant village during a famine. The people were so encrusted with filth that their skin appeared black beneath the grime. Many had sores that wept constantly, yet they dare not wash them for fear of worsening their condition. The children especially were pitiable, their hair so matted with mud and excrement that it was impossible to tell where their hair ended and their clothing began. These children, if they survived, would grow up to become adults who knew nothing different, who had no reference point for what clean meant because they had never experienced it. They would marry and have children of their own in the same single-room houses where entire families slept on straw that was changed perhaps twice a year, where pigs and chickens often shared the living space, especially in winter, where the floor absorbed every spill, every bodily fluid, every bit of organic matter, creating a surface that was essentially composted filth. In the account books of a Parisian merchant from 1342 AD, there's a description of collecting taxes from a peasant household. The woman was preparing our meal on the same table where a baby had just soiled itself and where a chicken had been plucked the day before. She saw nothing amiss in this, and when I expressed concern, she looked at me as though I had spoken in tongues. The cruel arithmetic of medieval peasant hygiene came down to impossible choices made with impossible resources. Water was scarce and contaminated. Soap required animal fat they couldn't spare. Fuel for heating water competed with fuel for cooking and staying warm. Time spent on personal cleanliness was time not spent working in fields or tending animals or preparing food. And every attempt at washing carried the risk of infection, illness, or death from exposure. So they made their peace with filth. They developed remarkable resilience, immune systems that could handle parasite loads that would kill modern people. Children who survived their first few years often developed resistance to local diseases. Communities remained relatively healthy while epidemics devastated urban areas, simply because they'd been exposed to similar pathogens before and survived. But this adaptation came at a terrible cost. Life expectancy was brutally short. Infant mortality was catastrophic. Chronic pain was universal. And the psychological burden of constant physical discomfort, itching that never stopped, hunger that was rarely satisfied, cold that seeped into bones, pain from infected gums and rotting teeth and festering sores, shaped human consciousness in ways we can barely imagine. In a confessor's manual from 1285 AD, priests are warned to ask penitents whether they have taken excessive care in washing their bodies, for this shows pride and concern with worldly appearance rather than the soul's salvation. Some peasants deliberately avoided washing as a form of religious devotion, believing physical filth demonstrated spiritual purity. The woman who made soap couldn't afford to use it. The water carrier's children drank from brown buckets. The sick were afraid to wash their wounds. The clean were suspected of vanity or worse. And through it all, in that single room where Guillaume de Montfort's family slept on straw rustling with life, where Marguerite coughed in the darkness and their children scratched at welts that would never fully heal, the rooster crowed again. Another day was beginning, another day of survival in a world where being clean wasn't a choice or a virtue or even a possibility. It was simply unimaginable. They carried water that would kill us. They wore clothes that would poison us. They lived in conditions we've legally classified as uninhabitable. Yet they loved their children with the same fierce devotion we do. They found joy in the same small moments, a good harvest, a warm fire, a song shared in the darkness. They were human beings like us, facing challenges we'll never know, surviving through courage we can barely comprehend, and in their survival, in the children who lived to carry brown water to their own families, in the adaptation that allowed human life to persist in the midst of conditions that seemed designed to prevent it. In all of this, they gave us the most fundamental gift imaginable. They gave us our existence. Every breath we take, every moment of comfort we experience, every hot shower and bar of soap and glass of clean water, all of it flows from their endurance. The straw rustles in the darkness. The cough echoes. The itch never stops. And somehow, impossibly, life continues.